Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. If you're new, my name is Bobby. Guys, today is a super interesting video. I wanted to check this out in my private time. It's called How Muslims Influenced Thomas Jefferson and America's Founders by the YouTube channel PBS. Yeah, as I said, I want to watch this video in my spare time, but why not kill two birds with one stone, so to speak? Let's watch this video together. But guys, before we do so, as always, if you enjoy my content, leave me a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and check out the links in the description box below to further support my work. And now, with no further ado, let's have a look.
The Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. is one of America's oldest federal institutions. Among its vast collections, many materials date back to our nation's founding. I've come here to see two books that offer very different views of the early United States and the place of Muslims within it. One book contains an English translation of the Quran, Islam's sacred text, and was once owned by Thomas Jefferson.
No way.
That's Jefferson's initial. The little T before the I.
The other book was written by an enslaved African man brought to America during Jefferson's presidency. On this first page,
I think he was from
that's
Senegal.
Quran, isn't it?
It is. Omar ibn Said was a teacher of Islam before he was sold into slavery.
Yeah,
Together,
this man was Senegalese.
these two books represent the
sure.
promise and contradictions of America, where some Muslims were included in ideas of religious freedom, championed by the nation's founders, while others were denied all their rights, including the right to practice their religion. Thomas Jefferson is well known as the author of the Declaration of Independence, and for serving as the third president of the United States. He's less well known for owning a copy of the Quran. That began to change in 2007, when Keith Ellison, the first Muslim elected to Congress, swore his private oath of office on Jefferson's copy of the Quran.
No, that's amazing.
People didn't
man.
know that Jefferson owned the Quran and had it as an important part of his library, but the United States has always been a country with an Islamic presence. Never not. Never not.
Muslims are rarely mentioned in the story of the nation's founding. So I want to know more about why Jefferson owned a copy of the Quran and what it can tell us about the place of Muslims in early America.
Yeah, this video is really fascinating. Thomas Jefferson has been described as a deist by many, but I think that this is really somewhat of an umbrella term. He was still culturally a Christian, but Thomas Jefferson indeed rejected the Trinity. And you can see that as well in his works, for example, the Thomas Jefferson Bible, believe it or not, in which he speaks about the morals of Jesus and kind of removes himself, distances himself from miracles and supernatural elements. He's rather focusing on Jesus' moral teachings. Some claimed as well that Thomas Jefferson was somewhat of a naturalist, that he put the law of nature over Christianity ultimately, so it was kind of diffuse. I didn't know, however, that he actually owned a copy of the Quran.
The fact that Jefferson has a copy of the Al-Quran is a tribute to the power of Islam and Muslims in world history.
Sure, of course.
This is one of the great texts of the world. In order to be an educated person, you had to know about the Quran.
Jefferson's fundamental curiosity would compel him to buy a Quran, to learn about Islam, to want to think about what Islamic philosophy would teach him about government.
These
Yes, you don't want to miss out.
leaders who
That is for
became head
sure.
of government.
That is actually something that happened to me as well. You guys know my story. At first I was a hardcore fundamentalist Orthodox Christian, and therefore I saw Islam as the enemy and I wanted to find the devil within the Quran, surely. But at the same time, I was already in my early 30s and I matured as a person, I like to believe. And therefore, my worldview changed already substantially. I thought to myself, I might as well look into the enemy's book for the reason of learning about the structures within Islam, for the reason of simply acquiring knowledge about Islam, understanding what that religion is about. But this really is something that people later in life, if they keep an open mind, come to. They realize, why should I keep myself restricted in a box? I might have been born as a Hindu or as a Christian. Why do I have to restrain myself and simply stay in this box without checking the outside world, so to speak, without checking the other great works that are thousands and thousands of years old? Why restrict myself? Why limit myself? And therefore, I believe that a great thinker will, of course, check all the available resources present to him.
Were great readers, and the British before them had, in fact, contact with Muslim kingdoms, such as the Ottoman Empire from the 16th century, and North African kingdoms in the 17th century. So Americans inherited a transatlantic connection.
That is true, yes. They were in contact.
Islam wasn't as foreign as many people would have thought it would have been at the time.
Sometimes we think about America and its relationship to the West and this kind of manifest destiny of pushing West, rather than the Atlantic world relationships that were essential at the end of the 18th century and through the 19th century. When we think about early America, the founders, it was a profoundly global moment.
It became a global culture.
My next
ultimately.
stop is Jefferson's home in Central Virginia, a mansion that reflects the power and privilege of early America's white land-holding elite.
SubhanAllah, and still here.
This is where Jefferson kept a copy of his Quran before selling most of his books to the Library of Congress in 1815.
Eamon.
Pleasure to meet you.
It's a pleasure to meet you.
How you doing?
Welcome to Monticello.
Thank you.
Historian John Ragosta has spent much of his career studying Jefferson, especially his attitude towards religion and its role in the early republic.
So, Eamon, welcome to Jefferson's study. This, before he sends all those books to the Library of Congress, this would have been lined with books. There would have been bookcases everywhere. He has 6,500 books that he sells to the Library of Congress. And of course, among them is his Quran. So people talk about the Jefferson Quran. Sometimes hear people say, well, he wanted to know his enemies.
Yeah.
It's completely ridiculous. He buys that Quran in 1765 when he's a student. He's interested in comparative religion. He's interested in law. He has a number of books on North African nations, on Muslim nations. They're probably over in that area of the library.
What does that say about Jefferson compared to some of his peers?
He's certainly more advanced than many people of his era in this regard. That through science, through our minds, the illimitable freedom of the human mind Jefferson talks about, we're going to improve. Each generation is going to learn from the last. And it's through study of things like the Quran and comparative religion, through studies of comparative laws, that's going to make us a better people.
Exactly.
Let's go on into the parlor.
You have to check everything available. Otherwise, you restrict yourself and you don't
Here
learn
on the
anything.
wall, we see the great
And even
explorers.
if you believe that Islam is the enemy, even if that is the case, then you have to go by the premise, keep your friends close, but your enemies closer. You can always learn from your enemy.
Political leaders, scientists, and philosophers, Francis Bacon, Isaac Newton, and John Locke. John Locke, he actually has to flee England because religious disputes he's worried about his life at that point in time. He writes the Second Letter of Toleration, and Locke says we should be open politically to Jews and to Mohammedans, which is the term they would use for Muslims. Jefferson says we can go further than Locke. In America, all people can participate in religious freedom.
Jefferson's commitment to
the
the
idea of
that
America
all citizens
was
should
truly
be free
beautiful.
to practice their religion as they choose can be seen in a bill he wrote for the Virginia State Legislature in 1777, a document that's thought to have shaped the religious clauses in the Bill of Rights. Some founders argued that the government should favor Protestant Christians over all other traditions, but Jefferson was clear. In his autobiography, he stated that his law included the Jew and the Gentile, the Christian and the Mohammedan, the Hindu and the infidel of every denomination.
So at the very foundation of this country, there was one of the founding fathers imagining Muslim Americans.
Absolutely. He understands that's going to happen.
To think about Muslims as future citizens was a way of imagining a completely new nation that included more than just Christians, particularly Protestant Christians.
Absolutely. This is so mind-blowing because as people, obviously, we are born in a specific time frame and then you simply become a product of your culture, a product of your environment. And therefore, in my age, what was coming over from America was this hatred for Islam, of course, because of 9/11. Everybody was scared of terrorists. And it seemed like this is when Islam out of a sudden appeared in America. Prior to that, there was no Islam in America. Everybody was white, was watching wrestling, Arnold Schwarzenegger movies, driving pickup trucks, and eating hamburgers, ultimately. This is how we imagined America. And this was the image of America that was essentially projected onto the world through mainstream media. But then all of a sudden, Islam appeared with the face of Osama bin Laden. So it was presented as this foreign entity that came out of nowhere and now is taking over the free world with their repressive, regressive religion. But now looking at this, you can see that Islam was there from the get-go of America. This is really unbelievable.
Muslims into the conversation, mentioning them in documents. There's some foreshadowing of the hopes and aspirations of what the country could become.
Where are we right now?
Well, we're actually coming up on Thomas Jefferson's grave site, which is down below the Monticello, the house. But this is where Jefferson is buried. And unlike most of us, Jefferson actually specifies what he wants on his tombstone. And he says, I want it to say, here was buried Thomas Jefferson, author of the American Declaration of Independence, of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia. And then he writes, and not a word more.
To see religious freedom on the tombstone, that feels very significant.
This was America. This is the nation they were building. It's going to be built on political freedom, religious freedom, public education.
Yes, of course. Yes, it is, of course, a huge part of America, this religious freedom indeed, because if you look into the early Americans, when they left Britain, they left for a reason, of course, and they left because of the power that the church, the Anglican Church, held in the UK. They were ultimately fleeing from religious oppression.
Jefferson's vision of America offered the possibility that any citizen of any faith could practice it freely. It opened the door for all citizens to participate politically, too.
And the fact that Jefferson held on to the image of Muslims as people who might one day not only have religious freedom but political equality is really the beginning, I think, of his political understanding of a future society that had a universal, inclusive precedence for the future.
Jefferson clearly thought about Muslims in theory. In practice, he had little contact. Documents from the time record just one meeting with a Muslim man here in the United States, which took place while Jefferson was president.
In 1805, the first Muslim ambassador to the United States arrived from Tunis. We were in the middle of an undeclared war that Thomas Jefferson had waged against Tripoli. Tunis was an ally of Tripoli. So the Tunisian ambassador was sent to negotiate with President Jefferson. He was dressed in finery of all sorts of brocade, gold, scarlet, and he had a diamond snuff box that was the talk of the town. Whereas a New Hampshire senator who was at this meeting said that Jefferson appeared scruffy by comparison. Jefferson received him at a state dinner that he set the time for at 3:30 in the afternoon.
Well, someone let it be known that Meli Meli is obviously Muslim and it's Ramadan. And Jefferson doesn't skip a beat. He says, okay, then dinner will begin precisely at sundown.
Which indicates that Jefferson learned from his Quran and from other books about what Muslims believe.
And Meli Meli arrives very shortly after sundown. and then they break bread and have an iftar dinner. This is often referred to as the first iftar
really
dinner
mind-blowing,
in the White House, and it's happening in Jefferson's presidency.
Jefferson's treatment of Meli Meli is revealing. Here was a man of power and influence from a part of the world the founders associated with Islam. This made him very different from the many Muslims already living here by this time.
The founders are thinking about Islam and they're thinking about Muslims, but they're thinking about the kind of great centers of Islamic learning and power in what we now call the Middle East.
It was a very different image back then, of course.
They're not
There
thinking
was no
about
mainstream
Muslims
media.
who are in the new United States. Thousands upon thousands of enslaved African Muslims
yep.
being shipped to the Americas.
And they've been forced into Christianity as well.
Many of the places from which people were horrifically taken in West Africa were places impacted by Islam. And so the people who were brought to America, estimates range from thousands to tens of thousands, were Muslim.
There is evidence for the presence of enslaved African Muslims. You see it in runaway advertisements. You also see it in plantation records of slave names. We actually do have a few narratives that have been penned by African Muslims enslaved here, and some of them are written in Arabic.
There's no firm evidence of Muslim presence at Monticello. But this was a plantation where Jefferson, the person who wrote that all men are created equal, enslaved over 400 people over his lifetime.
You can actually see some of the fingerprints in the bricks. Enslaved children likely are forming these bricks. You know, here in the bricks,
Oh, wow.
young children,
Oh, wow.
when these bricks were formed 230 years ago.
Wow.
But it's a brutal
Yeah.
system.
Yeah.
And literally, they're the ones who are making the material that builds this mansion. You don't have Monticello at that time built like this without that enslaved labor that Jefferson is using.
Yeah, but it was impossible
Enslaved
otherwise
people
during
built
that
this
time.
country.
As long as we're talking about the founding principles that established a nation based on freedom, then we have to be talking about slavery and the unfree. As long as we're talking about George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, we have to be talking about their slaves. Because any ideas they had about human freedom and how it would flourish, and the conditions in which it would flourish, are immediately contradicted by the fact that they held slaves and that the United States becomes, by the mid-19th century, the largest slave society in modern history.
Yeah, fair enough, he said, in the modern day, but ultimately, man, we have to mention other civilizations that enslaved as well prior to America. Otherwise, we're simply repeating, oh, the evil white man, the evil white Westerner enslaved the whole world. But we're speaking about Islam here, and of course we have to admit that within the Islamic caliphates you had the Arab slave trade. Yeah, that was huge. Estimated 17 million people were enslaved and traded across North Africa, the Middle East and Asia during that time. Then of course you had slavery in the Roman Empire, and even Jesus Christ, and America is a Christian nation after all, was not explicitly against slavery. And then if you speak about the modern times, then you cannot forget about the Brazilian slave trade after all, the Portuguese, right? So I find it very unfair that the focus is always on America, the evil, evil white Westerners, they enslaved everybody. No, slavery is part of human history till modernity ultimately, and it was very, very needed. Yes, now looking back, we can see how reprehensive it is, but ultimately it was needed during that time. And let me tell you, this time now, with all the wage slaves ultimately, all the poor workers everywhere on this planet right now, you can believe me when I say that in 100, 200, 300 years, people will look back on this time and will look at people that had jobs just like us here, were absolute slaves, and that it was absolutely immoral. Point of the story is this, of course, the fallacy of presentism, where you try to fit everything those people did into the lens of today.
It's among these enslaved people People with no rights of any kind, let alone the right to practice their religion, that a very different picture of Muslims in early America emerges. These Muslims weren't imaginary future citizens from far away. They were real people, right here, struggling to keep their faith and traditions alive, often in the most difficult circumstances. Evidence of at least 2 enslaved Muslims can be found on the plantation of another former president, George Washington.
Welcome to the library. This is a page from George Washington's tax list, they call tithables list, from 1774. And this is the first document that shows a person with a Muslim name. Right in here you can see the name Fatima.
Yeah.
And under here is little Fatima.
That's the name of the prophet's
daughter.
Fatima.
This makes it very real for me.
The idea that there would have been a Fatima and a little Fatima, that suggests strongly that there was a mother and daughter. A mother who had control over nothing in her life except the name she gave her child, who was also enslaved.
This is cash is being paid for the following Negroes: Abram, Oxford, Tom, Jack, Edie, Fatimore. All those people brought in 2,303 pounds and 19 shillings.
This is years before the Declaration of Independence, and here we have evidence that Muslims might have lived here. Do we know anything else about Fatima?
It gives you an idea of how hard, maybe in a family situation, it might be to pass on Islam in a family, because if they are a mother and daughter, they're being split up here.
I can't imagine if I would have been Muslim at all, had I been separated from my parents in this way.
Washington's name is often associated with freedom. Freedom from the British, and religious freedom. He was committed to that idea too. Knowing he enslaved people here, some of them Muslim, is hard to take in.
Alright guys, and this is it for today's video. I'm going to cut it off here because I really don't like the direction that the video is going. At first, I really enjoyed the video. It was mind-blowing information that Thomas Jefferson owned a Quran, but then ultimately they made it about slavery and how evil and atrocious it was. Listen guys, I'm not here to tell you that slavery is great. No, quite the opposite, of course, in the Quran we read. But he has not attempted the steep path. And what will make you understand what the steep path is? It is the freeing of a slave. In Sahih Bukhari we read, "Whoever frees a slave, Allah will free all of his body parts from the hell fire, as he freed the body parts of the slave." So here you see that there is an incentive for freeing slaves, that freeing a slave is something that will free you from hellfire ultimately. But at the same time, we cannot be hypocritical here, because the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ owned slaves as well. Now, I have to say this, the word slavery, the word slave has been very, very tainted with all of this propaganda now coming from America, this SJW propaganda, and this perception of what slavery is based on certain atrocities that happened, no doubt about it, in the time of early America. But the harsh reality that the modernist mind simply cannot comprehend is that we wouldn't be here without slavery. It was indeed truly needed, just as it is needed right now that you have children working in sweatshops in China and other children working in mines so you can enjoy your iPhone. Unfortunately, in this world of conquest and economic growth, you will have winners and you will have losers. This is human history, and it hasn't ended. As I said, to this very day, people are suffering. Even most people watching my videos here, you're still suffering in your 9-to-5 job. It's not something that you want to do, but something that you have to do. And therefore, it is enslavement in a way as well. It was always like that, and it will be going on. There is a split of people into different classes. The main difference here is that back in the day, the slave knew that he was a slave indeed. In this modern day and age, most people don't know truly what they are. Alright guys, but this is it for today's video. If you liked it, leave it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and check out the links in the description box below to further support my work. And as always, may God bless you all. Much love and peace.
يا نفس إن لم تظفري لا تجزعي